My name's Lars. I work for a great big ugly science association down in Washington. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about mapping and remote sensing for human rights organizations particularly. Basically, we've been funded since 2006 by the MacArthur Foundation first, and then the Oak Foundation and Open Society as well, to provide mapping and satellite imagery support to human rights NGOs primarily. These are some of the areas that we've worked in over the last few years. Again, we basically sit in our offices and look at these areas. It's not as if we go there, the organizations go there themselves. If any of these are of interest to you, we can certainly talk about them a little bit later. Really what we're trying to do is kind of always push the envelope in the sort of analysis that we're able to do. Why is this sort of stuff important for human rights organizations? First of all, it's a documentation purpose, ideally for actual litigation. So Darfur, Sri Lanka, and Ethiopia results that we generated have been given to the International Criminal Court, US government war crimes investigations, and UN investigators as well. There's also a basic monitoring capability that you can do with satellites, places like Darfur, Sri Lanka, DR Congo, etc. Also, it's basically an advocacy product. Satellite images are rather sexy and rather compelling, and if you use them within your advocacy campaigns, it helps essentially get attention. So we generally generate things like Google Earth layers and everything from JPEGs down to printed maps, etc. Before you can kind of get to the imagery stage, you have to do the mapping, of course, and the reporting that we deal with is often collections of events and place names. And place names are, of course, problematic, as we've talked about. Translation, transliteration, and just drift in how an individual place name is represented or communicated all has an effect on finding these places. It's easy in some areas. Lebanon, no problem. Very, very difficult in others. Eastern Congo, Darfur is still a problem. Eastern Burma, very, very difficult. There is a growing use of GPS. We try and encourage that. We provide GPS units, et cetera, et cetera. Also things like satellite tracking devices, but those are still a minority. Human rights groups really like to use things that they can destroy at a moment's notice. So kind of the more advanced it gets, the more problematic it becomes. Our sources for mapping tend to be ones you've probably heard of, a US Department of Defense database called GeoNet Names. One of our special ones that we like to play with are old Soviet military maps that we essentially get digitized and we extract the place names out of those. Those do cost money. There's, of course, many other maps. For Burma, we go all the way back to US Army Air Force maps from World War II. Locally produced maps are always very, very valuable. UNP codes, if we can get them. We basically combine all those within GIS and associated databases and run fuzzy searches on them to match reporting with places. In general, the mapping is always incomplete, which is always a problem for us. Once we do the mapping, we can actually get to the satellite work. This is what we think of as our constellation of satellites that we can make use of. I'm not going to go through them all. The important one, in my opinion, is Worldview 1, which was launched about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. That's basically only tasked by the US government, so only US government can tell that one where to look. But once the imagery is acquired, we can basically buy it out of the archives. You'll also notice that a lot of these say 50 centimeter NGO resolution. Under US law, all publicly available satellite imagery has to be 50 centimeter, or degraded to 50 centimeter resolution. Some of these sensors will provide 40 centimeter resolution imagery, but before it gets to me, it's downgraded to 50 centimeter resolution. There are other French, Taiwanese, and South Korean options available. There's an Indian option as well. Some of those are useful in political contexts. If you want to use an Indian satellite to prove atrocities in Burma, for example, that can be helpful. In terms of the time frames that we're talking about, if you're looking at an area where US government is interested, your turnaround time for an image is very, very fast. So things like Sri Lanka, South Ossetia, we were able to get images, you know, kind of as the conflicts developed, which was very, very helpful. Basically, USG is the only one with the bucks and the pull to get that thing pointed very, very quickly. Clouds can, of course, still interfere. And if there's no US government interest, we're looking at timeframes maybe of 2 weeks if you're lucky, up to 6 months. It can take forever. We have had a couple instances where we have gotten on our images within 24 hours, but those have been an exception. Clouds are always a factor. Competition for acquisition is the other factor. Essentially, if I'm placing a $2,000 order next to someone placing a $20 million order, guess who they're going to go with? In terms of our analysis, we're generally just doing a visual comparison of before versus after imagery. It's easy yet laborious. We use more automated methods to identify areas of imagery which changed, but our final analysis is always basically just a manual comparison and markup. Anyone can do it, my mother could do it, et cetera, et cetera. This is one of our standard products. This is something we released on Monday. This is a destroyed village in eastern Congo in the area of a village called Busarungi. It's our standard damage assessment product. This is a 2009 image collected, or a January 2009 image collected by the US government's Worldview satellite versus a September 2009 image which we specifically requested. You'll notice I ordered that image in May. We didn't get it until September, but the quality is good, and it's just a basic process of counting structures here and then determining which ones have been destroyed over here. You can also use this proactively. This is a project that we did with Amnesty International. This is a screenshot from their website. This is a village called Hishaba in Darfur, and basically we think of this as protective imaging, where we repeatedly get imagery of locations that are kind of in remote areas that outside investigators can't get to. And then Amnesty makes the case that we're basically watching these locations, which has basically an advocacy component, et cetera, et cetera. This is very, very useful. People like to do it. Unfortunately, it's relatively expensive, $2,000 an image. If you're doing 10 sites, you're talking $20,000 for each basically update of your site, so it becomes problematic. We do, as I mentioned, try to push the envelope a little bit. This is an image, blurry little one from Sri Lanka. These are basically possible mortar positions where the red arrows are pointed. Again, we're not seeing mortar tubes in here or really anything that indicates that it's definitely a mortar. It's just the configuration of how these things are laid out. If you look in a US Army field manual, they call this the lazy W layout. We can also then look at craters that occurred within the Sri Lankan conflict zone. This little white spot there is a crater, I swear. The red lines I added, basically what that indicates is the spray of the soil that came out of the crater when the shell impacted. Based on that spray, you can basically determine the vector of approach for the shell that hit that location. And if you extrapolate that from these craters up here, they nicely line up with these black circles down here, which were Sri Lankan government mortar positions and artillery positions in the area. So that's the sort of analysis that we try and do whenever possible. Really only a minority of craters produce that sort of spray, so it's not always possible. This is a screenshot from a radar satellite. This is destroyed structures in eastern Congo, I swear. Radar satellites are useful because they're cloud penetrating. Clouds are a big limiting factor on everything else, but if we can use tools like this, we can basically get through the clouds. Again, this is an analytical product. An analyst would be able to make use of this, but it probably wouldn't make a good advocacy product. There's also satellites that detect fires. This line graph over here is basically a time series of fire detections in Darfur since early 2000. And what you're seeing here is the seasonal variation of fires being used for agriculture, and then this giant spike is the height of the genocidal period in late 2003. If we do some simple math on that and you kind of do a density distribution of where above average fire detections occurred, you get something like this, which the darker the area, the more intense the fire was, the more above average it was, and you can basically map the areas of conflict based on that. The nice thing about fire data is the data is delivered 4 times per day, so you really are possibly talking about an active monitoring system. That's what we're working on right now, and we'll hopefully get results out there sometime soon. That's me. I love to talk. Talk to me if you need me.